Welcome to Aquatics by Nature. Today I'd like to talk a little about algal blooms, especially in established tanks, and how these in some circumstances can actually be the early warning signs of some much more serious issues, namely a potential complete tank crash. Regular viewers will probably recognise this tank as my 29-year-old low maintenance, no water change, no fertiliser aquarium. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, at first glance, there isn't really anything wrong with this tank. You know, it's nice and green, there's lots of plant growth in the tank, the fish are cruising around looking quite happy, and it all looks sort of quite well in actual fact. Granted, it's all a little bit sort of overgrown and could do with a little bit of a trim, etc. But at a glance, it doesn't actually look too bad. However, if you look a little bit more closely, you can probably, or may be able to see, depending on how well the camera picks it up, that I'm actually starting to get some types of algae in the tank now. The very feathery plant in the centre, the ambulia, which is growing right to the top, if you look closely, you can actually see that there's a certain amount of algae actually on and in between the leaves, sort of matting it all together, giving it a not quite as crisp or nicer look as it would normally have. Also, if you look at some of the surface leaves on the tiger lotus lily on the right hand side, one or two of the leaves have actually got holes in and are sort of decaying, and again there's a certain amount of algae on the stems and the leaves themselves. And also, if you look at the Amazon sword on the right hand side, you can see there's quite a lot of sort of deteriorating or yellowing or slightly sort of disintegrating leaves, again picking up a little bit of algae. But the one thing that you probably can't see, certainly very well from this particular shot, and I'll try and cut in another shot in the edit, is that the surface of the tank has actually got a really thick green sort of biofilm on the surface there. The film itself is actually giving the whole tank something of a kind of a green cast at the moment, although the water itself is actually still crystal clear. It's a bit of a strange illusion in actual fact. But all of these sort of relatively minor things on the surface, they're basically what I would consider as warning signs that something isn't quite right. Something is a little bit wrong here somewhere. And probably the most worrying is actually the surface film, because the surface film actually tends to indicate that there's quite poor circulation and quite poor gas exchange. And this means that there is a potential for the fish to actually run out of oxygen during the night, and then your tank could literally crash if you're not very careful. And even if that wasn't the case, there's also a possibility that the shortage of oxygen caused by the poor gas exchange could actually mean that the filter would actually be less efficient, and you could also get a deterioration in water quality, which could end in the same sort of basic scenario. So definitely really thick surface films and poor circulation is something that I always take very seriously, because it can end rather badly, unfortunately. But one of the most important things when you see a tank going a little bit out of kilter like this, I've always found, is to try and catch things in time. When you see these sort of things, the quicker you act on them, the quicker you can solve the problem. And even if things don't get bad enough to actually affect the fish, what you normally find, or I've certainly found, is that these are kind of the perfect conditions to actually stimulate and get some of the really nasty algae outbreaks. Not just the green algae I have at the moment, but some of the really horrible ones, like the really thick black beard algae, for example, which can really destroy a tank if you're not careful. And certainly at this stage, as I say, it's much easier to prevent going into that stage than it is actually to cure it. So that's definitely the plan that I have anyway. So I guess probably what you're all asking is, so what is actually causing all of this? Well, to be perfectly honest, it's pretty much entirely my fault. I've been extremely busy with other projects over the last 2 or 3 months. So this tank has basically been neglected over that period of time. Literally all I've done for the last 3 months really is to feed the fish and perhaps give the glass a quick wipe, and maybe pull the odd bit of plant out occasionally just in passing. But the tank has really been left to itself. But unfortunately it's now got to the point where it's been left to itself for too long. And even a very, very low maintenance type of tank like this does need a certain amount of regular input. And if you leave the tank too long, then eventually something will go wrong. And this is really my tank telling me that I need to get a little bit more hands-on and correct things before they get worse. But one of the biggest problems I find of leaving a tank too long like this is that you tend to get a build-up of organic material. And this is especially true if your tank is already quite an old established tank. And obviously this one being 29 years old, it is extremely established. And what I mean by this is basically the amount of organic material in the tank that the tank is trying to break down actually into its sort of constituent parts. When you have a lot of that material in a tank, you do tend to get all sorts of problems. And I know for a fact in this tank that the actual filter sponges in this tank, there's actually 4 of them in the right hand compartment there, and they will at the moment have so much decaying material in them that they will literally almost be solid blocks of filtered material that are completely full and almost entirely clogged up with organic material. The problem with this is not just having all this organic material in the tank, but because it's clogging the filter, it's slowing the flow. And that reduction of flow rather is actually one of the things that is hindering the gas exchange and kind of facilitating the surface film as well to some degree. And as I say, the gas exchange is a critically important part of any tank. And if the gas exchange is poor, it leaves you open to the possibility of the oxygen level being poor in the tank. And because the filter needs oxygen to break down the waste products, you get this kind of vicious circle where the more clogged up the filter is, the less oxygen is available, so the less efficient the filter becomes. And this vicious circle just ends up as a sort of downward spiral if you're not really careful. And over a period of time, and in this case it's about 3 months since I've really done anything, the net result of this tends to be an increase in this organic material in the tank, and even actually in the water column. And sometimes you can actually see it actually in the water, because the water will actually take on something of a sort of yellow cast. But apart from the sort of green effect that you're getting from the surface film, the water in this tank is actually crystal clear, so it proves that doesn't always happen at the end of the day. But what I've always found is that when you get into a situation where you have this very, very high organic loading, but not that good a sort of oxygen control, shall we call it, I've always found this is a major cause or almost an excuse for algal outbreaks. These are pretty much always the circumstances where algae tends to get a foothold, and this is especially true when it's combined with surface film issues. It just sort of exacerbates the whole thing. So I would just describe it as an organic overload, really. And as I say, algae thrives under these conditions. So, okay, I guess you're probably asking, well, how will I actually fix this on this tank? And as many of you will know, I like to keep the maintenance on this tank super simple and easy. And under normal circumstances, I would advocate sort of a little and often approach. But having neglected this tank for so long, I feel I need to be somewhat more hands-on just to get on top of things before they really do get out of control. And it's really just a matter, as I say, of cracking on and fixing the problem. I certainly don't want a tank full of blackbeard algae, because that's a really tough fix if it goes down that direction. So basically my rule of thumb anyway is, if it's not right, take action. And the first thing that I would address is definitely the filter, because the flow and the gas exchange is the most critical thing to the fish particularly. But as I say, it has an impact on everything that goes on in your tank, and preventing a potential tank crash is always top of the list. And believe you me, tank crashes are horrible things, so you really don't want to let that happen. Some of you will probably know that the filter compartment on the right hand side of this tank, it actually contains 4 big square sponge blocks effectively. And as I say, these blocks I know will be almost entirely full of organic material. So what I would normally do is just clean 1 or 2 of these foams at a time in the tank. But I think in this circumstance I need to be a little bit more drastic. So basically I will take a slightly different sort of tack to normal really. I will actually take about half a bucket of water out of the tank, and then I will actually squeeze these sponges thoroughly in that aquarium water, because in that way it shouldn't actually entirely disrupt the microorganisms that live in the filter. There should be a good percentage that are actually preserved, so that it hopefully shouldn't shock the tank too much, as it were. And it does help that the tank has plenty of plants in the tank, because they are to some degree a filter in your tank. But whenever you do anything drastic with a filter, you do have to be a little bit careful. The second thing that I will do is actually take the actual power head which runs the filter out and give that a really good clean, so that once it actually is cleaned out and what have you, and the pump is put on, that the flow is sort of maximized and it's really properly back to normal. And one of the things you find with pumps is when you get a very high organic loading on a tank, you get a really, really thick slimy biofilm on your pumps. And that can actually really slow down the performance of them. So it's worth giving them a good scrub with a toothbrush every now and again. And the next thing that I will do is I will actually try and remove as much of those older decaying leaves that are actually in the tank, any of the sort of yellowing foliage or foliage that's got lots of holes in and is sort of crumbling, as it were. The main reason for this is that decaying foliage releases all sorts of compounds into the water, and algae seems to really love those compounds, and it can go really sort of crazy on those. So by removing as much of this as possible, I've always found is really helpful when it comes to just sort of sorting out a tank and getting things back to normal, as it were. The other thing, the ambulia, the fluffy plant in the middle of the tank that actually has got algae really quite caked into it, that and the water lettuce, which you may have noticed, instead of the roots being bright white, sort of pure, they're actually kind of a rather green and slimy at the moment. So both the water lettuce and the ambulia, I will be removing all the ones that look really quite bad, just to eliminate as much of that kind of algae out of the tank as I possibly can. But in kind of keeping with my sort of long-term maintenance regime, I won't be doing anything too drastic. So for example, I won't be siphoning or disturbing the substrate in any way. It's something that I always try and avoid. I really, as I say, will concentrate on trying to get the flow and the gas exchange back to normal as quickly as I can, and then I'll simply rely on the filter to collect any excess organic material that may actually be in the tank. And it may actually be the case that it may be necessary for me to actually clean the filter again very shortly if there's a lot of build-up, that the extra flow kicks up and then sort of sucks up, as it were. But only time will sort of really tell on that, but we'll just have to see. I've always found that this is not only the sort of simplest way of sort of solving these problems, but it's also the sort of least disruptive. So it's always the sort of my plan of action when this does happen, which it does happen occasionally. We all get busy times in our lives and things happen we're not expecting. So the tanks do tend to have little blips along the way, but it's being able to fix them that is always the important thing. The only other thing really that I'll be doing is I'll actually be adding some more amano shrimps to the tank. My existing population is actually well over 20 years old, and as it's inevitably sort of depleted a little bit over the years, so it's time really to top them back up a bit. And I'll be aiming for a sort of stocking level of roughly 1 amano shrimp for every 10 litres or 2 gallons of water, because it's one of the things I've always found over the years is that seems to be a good sort of benchmark for them. And they're such fantastic critters. They're great algae eaters, fantastic at preventing algae coming in the first place, incidentally, which is probably just as important as actually eating algae. And they're literally invaluable to a tank. And I love them anyway. They're just some of the most fascinating creatures to have in a tank, especially when you get the really big females that are sort of well over 2 inches long. And certainly I've found from past experience, this kind of combination of just getting the flow and everything back to normal, a few more algae shrimps, and just basically tidying the tank up a little bit, it generally sorts things out relatively quickly. And that said, I will be monitoring things much more closely for the next few weeks, because there's always a possibility of getting a little bit of a blip along the way. And I guess probably what I should do is probably make a little follow-up video in a few weeks' time, just to show you how things are progressing, and hopefully things will be a little bit more normal and looking a little bit more aesthetically pleasing by then. Anyway, if you'd like to know more about how I maintain my tanks so naturally, without water changes or fertilisers, I'd be eternally grateful if you subscribe and give me a like. You can also check out my playlists, but most importantly, enjoy your aquarium. Don't be a slave to it. Thanks for watching.